Welcome everybody to this web chat tonight. I am Karen Hoskin, the Executive Director for the Cohousing Association of the US, and Karen Wave is my other half. We do all the cool stuff, such as offering things like these web chats. We also have an amazing new website. If you have not had a chance to play around, please do. Cohousing.org. There's a lot of information, some really cool pictures. I think it's really nicely organized. So what tonight looks like essentially is that Joe will present some information, and then there will be an opportunity for some questions and answers. So for those of you that do not know, this is Joe Cole. Joe, wave hello. He's a community member, facilitator, consultant. I don't even know what else is on your long CV list, but tonight he's going to be talking about culture change and personal transformation in community. So welcome, Joe, whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to try to share some slides, a slideshow. I think we did that last time, and I'm going to try it again, see if that works. All right, I'll say a few things and then we'll get to the slides, but I wanted to give a little overview of where we're going. And this topic is really interesting to me. I didn't come into community looking for personal growth and personal change, but it has become a really central theme for me. I lived in co-housing community for 6 years, and I was part of the development process for 3 years before I moved in. And after the move-in, during the first couple of years, there was a lot of challenges, decision-making challenges and conflict in our community. And we did not have a great level of skill in our group around conflict and facilitation. And so that motivated me to actually get trained as a facilitator. So I went through a 2-year training in facilitation. And one of the main things that I learned from that process was the importance of addressing conflict. And this was a challenge for me because I had always been conflict avoidant, going back to my family of origin. But increasingly, I saw that conflict skills and tools and agreements were really essential to the health and well-being of collaborative groups. And as I work with groups today as a consultant and a trainer and a facilitator, that's often the domain that I'm working in around conflict. And for me, it's been a big personal stretch and opportunity for growth and transformation, sometimes very painful series of opportunities in being in conflict. And I've come to understand, though, my journey in community is connected to this other journey of growth and transformation. I also want to talk about another dimension of personal growth, transformation, challenge that I've experienced in my community journey, and that is connected to racism and addressing racism and working for racial equity. I talked some about this in my previous web chat a few months back, but I wanted to touch on it again and make this connection to personal transformation and culture change. All right, so that's my setup, and let me see if I can successfully share these slides and see what happens here. Share that, and here we go. Okay. So I'm hoping to talk for maybe about 25 minutes, and then we can have 25 minutes to have a Q&A and discussion, open discussion. And I'm going to go through some of this kind of quickly, but we can come back to it in the question. But also, if you have any questions down the road, please feel free to email me, contact me, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. So I think, I don't know if you can see this, but my screen is kind of blocking this out with some of our faces, but the quote is from a book called Sitting in the Fire by Arnold Mendel, and it says, community is the biggest problem you will ever have, and also your most sacred teacher. So for me, this has been a reassuring quote that, when I read this, I felt like, oh yeah, somebody is getting my challenges and my opportunities for change and growth in community. That community has been one of the biggest problems that I've ever had in my life, and also this wonderful opportunity for learning and for growth and for making a contribution to the larger world. And so oftentimes in community development, we think about the physical infrastructure, you know, the houses and the buildings, and how are we going to finance that and pay for that, and what's a common house going to look like. But we don't want to forget the cultural, what I call the cultural infrastructure, because that's an essential part of community. And so typically, you know, this is an example from a community near me in Durham, North Carolina, called Solterra. So typically we're going to give a lot of thought to, you know, where do we put the common house, and what do the houses look like? Where's the garden going to be? How do we build the infrastructure? How do we pay for all this? And of course, that's all very important. But in my experience, you know, community is not just a physical infrastructure challenge or a technical challenge. It's a cultural challenge, and it's also an inspiration, and that's the source of meaning for me. I mean, I'm excited about renewable energy and natural building and sharing resources. That's really interesting and inspiring to me in my community journey. But also the sense of creating a collaborative culture. Can we create an alternative way that people live together and interact with one another? And so that's what I'm referring to as the cultural infrastructure, that intentional communities have the opportunity to create some alternatives to what I would call the dominant culture, which is focused more on competition and individualism, hierarchy. And so when we're thinking about the internal culture in our groups, we're referring to the governance system, our values, our work policies, our legal structure, our policies and agreements around conflict, our leadership, approach to leadership, and our connections and relationships with networks locally and regionally and nationally and internationally as well. How are we interfacing with Cohousing US, for example? And so can we shift our values from that competitive mindset to cooperation and sustainability and justice? And can we implement a cooperative governance system like consensus or sociocracy? Can we learn collaborative skills, new styles of leadership, feedback systems so we can give and receive feedback to one another, and conflict tools? This is a list, you know, it's not meant to be complete, but of some collaborative skills that I have identified in my community journey and my work as a facilitator and a trainer that are really important when people gather and come together. So that would include self-awareness, emotional intelligence, self-expression, listening, empathy, equity, and a sense of justice, the ability to research, and also to think creatively, and also to sit with a lot of uncertainty. A big shift in community life is focusing on the common good instead of personal preferences, being able to decide together instead of unilaterally, and also making a commitment to growth and healing, that, you know, I'm here in this community process to learn and to grow, and then being open to feedback along the way. So the two dimensions that I want to talk more specifically about with regards to growth and change and transformation are conflict and addressing racism. So that's where I want to go here. And like I said earlier, you know, in my life, I was raised to avoid conflict. It was always scary and painful, and so like this, you know, volcanic eruption in the image there in the illustration, you know, I wanted to get the heck out of there if there was conflict happening. And so that was a big learning and growth and stretch for me in my community life, that I could actually learn to, you know, to stay close to that volcano, even when it was erupting, and maybe, you know, try to learn methods and tools and techniques for intervening effectively, creatively, constructively. And also, you know, racism is a very difficult and challenging topic. But I think it's something that we in the communities movement have a responsibility to address, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. So where is conflict coming from? It can come from unmet needs, disempowerment, different views, different points of view, personal life changes, even the group life cycle. I have a close friend who lives in a community, and he was one of the founders, and the community's been around for about 25 years now, and it's changed greatly, and that's been very difficult for him and painful for him. And just yesterday we were talking about this idea that groups have a life cycle, that they go through the storming phase, and then they create norms and agreements and policies, and then they perform and they function well. And that's not going to last forever. Even if they get to that stage of performing well, eventually there's going to be a period of change, and potentially radical change. And that can be very difficult for people who have been there throughout the whole life cycle of the group. And then we have, these natural threat responses of fight, flight, and freeze that come up in conflict situations. Even when we're not really facing a deadly threat, our physiology can kick in and we can get into that mode. And so oftentimes in communities, we get stuck in what I call conflict hell, which, we start trying to identify, well, who's the good side and who's the bad side. Of course, the good side happens to be me, and the bad side is whoever's disagreeing with me and who's in conflict with me. And so, diagnosing and categorizing others, making judgments, shaming and blaming, these are all very common, I think, in our culture when we approach conflict. And we are often replaying old stories and dynamics. Like in my experience, I'm probably working out some stuff from my family of origin when I'm in conflict in my current community. And it helps to be aware that that's in play. But getting unstuck, if we start focusing on our feelings and our needs, and we see the common humanity that we share, and we recognize that we only have a part of the truth ourselves, and our stories about other people and the situation are always limited. And if we can develop compassion and focus on the common values that we share and be grateful for this process, even when we're in conflict and struggling, and taking responsibility for our part in the conflict, and instead of simplifying and oversimplifying the situation, can we what I call complexify the situation, and identify, what are we trying to create together? Identifying that future that we want to co-create or create together, and then take some time to grieve and recognize that, I believe we've all been hurt by conflict, and those wounds need to be healed. So can we approach conflict with curiosity and compassion, and can we welcome it? And this is a image from a story about the Buddha, where the Buddha was walking around with a group of monks, and there was an angry elephant that was rampaging through the streets, and the Buddha, everybody else, all the other monks just started running for their lives, but the Buddha approached the angry elephant, Nalagiri, and showed the elephant kindness and compassion, and the elephant calmed down, and everybody was safe. So this story, is a vision of how we might approach conflict differently. And of course, I don't claim to be the Buddha, and conflict can be very challenging to me, especially when I'm in the conflict. Excuse me, but even when I'm facilitating a conflict, the heat can get so hot that it's really difficult to navigate. But can I be in that moment with compassion and see the conflict as an opportunity? So help. So these are two models for conflict, for addressing conflict that I use. One is from the facilitator Laird Schaub, and the other one is nonviolent communication. You'll notice that they both have 4 steps. I'm not sure why my PowerPoint is just listing all of Laird's steps as number 1, but there should be 1, 2, 3, 4 on that slide. And they're very similar, talking about our experiences and our stories in the first step, and then our feelings in the second step. And the third step is what's going on, what's important, what are our needs and values. There's a difference in the 4th step, whereas in nonviolent communication, we can make requests of the other person. Can you offer something or change something or do something a little different? in Laird's model, we offer something ourselves. What am I willing to do to improve the situation? My current community, we combine these two approaches, and so we have a 5-step model where we use both of those 4 steps, where we talk, we make an offer. What am I willing to do to improve the relationship or the situation? And then I can also make a request of the other person. And I think conflict tools are very important. They're vital for the health of a community, and I think for personal relationships as well. But just like, if I go to the store and I buy some paintbrushes, that does not automatically make me an artist. I have to work, I have to practice. So communities really need to practice with these tools, and individuals do as well, to get good at using them. And there's some values that are built into nonviolent communication and other tools like this about reconnecting with somebody that we feel isolated from, developing compassion and our capacity to listen and understand, and really trying to repair the relationship. So it's viewing the other person as a human being just like me with important needs. And so some more assumptions here that everybody deserves to be heard, everybody's experiences are valid and needs are valid. We can learn from the conflict and the distress. There's important information there. And we're each responsible for our own feelings and our needs. And the goal is to try to meet everybody's needs as much as best as we can. So we want to move away from a right, wrong, good, bad framework to a sense of, what can I learn here? How can I better connect and improve my relationship? I'm not trying to win the conflict. I'm trying to engage in a cooperative approach that's more about learning and healing and understanding. And so that's a really big shift. I would say that's a really big cultural shift. And that's, for me, one of the exciting possibilities of intentional communities, that we can create a different culture together. And it really starts with our interpersonal relationships and our group dynamics. And we can see, how well we're doing when we get into conflict. When things are going well, we don't necessarily know how well are we doing. But when we get into conflict, that's going to be a good measure of what's going on and how well we're doing in creating a collaborative culture. So I recommend that communities really be conscious about, we're trying to create a culture of collaboration and care, not just some cool buildings with some energy efficiency and renewable energy. That's cool too. I like that stuff. But, we're also really trying to create a different culture and different relationships from what we see in the mainstream society. And then again, committing to this work consciously together and practicing and practicing and practicing. And it's really lifelong learning. It has been for me. So getting, moving from the personal, interpersonal, even group level to a larger view, I wanted to make this connection to sustainability in 4 dimensions. And if you notice, in the social dimension of sustainability, you see things like communication skills, decision-making, leadership. And that's what I've been talking about, that social dimension of sustainability. Excuse me. And so, we think about when we're in a conflict at the relational level or the group level, it's connected. It's connected to larger networks, larger cultures, larger social systems. And we can perhaps, have a positive impact on our networks, on our local communities, our region. And when we make cultural change happen at our group level, at the same time, at the group level, the small group level, or the neighborhood level, we're dealing with and we're facing conflicts that we've inherited from the larger system, from our history, from the structural level. And so we have to address those. And so that's why I wanted to also talk about a little bit about racism tonight and addressing racism, and how I believe that intentional communities, we have a responsibility to, especially in the United States, to address racism because of our history and because of the ongoing reality of racism. And so when we're talking about our commitment to community, to cooperation, to sustainability, then I hope and I encourage more and more communities to really look clearly and honestly at racism. So this is a little background. I'm not going to go through all this. I'm going to, and I can come back to it in the Q&A if you like, but basically my understanding is that, and this is supported by a lot of science and research, that there's no biological basis for race. It's a social political construct. And we know the history of how it was created. It's very interesting. In the context of the United States and the Americas, the notions of whiteness were created in the 16 and 1700s, and they were done so very consciously to basically quell some uprisings and rebellions that European colonists who were poor, indentured servants, were actually uniting with indentured servants and slaves who had come from Africa or been brought from Africa, and also some Native Americans. And they were resisting the colonial control of the elites. And this got the elites pretty worked up. And so they decided, the strategy of divide and conquer, that they would try to convince the poor Europeans that they had more in common with the elites than they did with the poor Africans and the poor Native Americans. And so the notion of whiteness developed in law and in the culture. Over time, it evolved. And then these ideas of racial categories as essential natural categories also developed. But we now know that that's fiction, and these racial categories don't really exist scientifically, but they're very important socially and politically, and they have a major impact on our lives. So I understand racism as a system of oppression. It involves prejudice around race, but it also involves power. So in this painting, you can see that there's a system of racial prejudice that is a power system, right? A hierarchy. And so white folks in this context have the power. And so their racial prejudice is very harmful and very damaging in ways that the folks in chains, if they had racial prejudice towards the Europeans, it's not systemic, it's not oppression, it's not harming the Europeans in the same way. So that's a really important distinction when we talk about racism and systems of oppression. Apologize for my coughing tonight. So there's a history that, some of which is very obvious, of institutional racism in the US, including slavery and segregation. But some important elements of the context in the United States include, in the 20th century, we had social programs like Social Security and minimum wage and federal housing that did not include people of color, and they were consciously created and written to exclude people of color. GI benefits after World War II, and this really harmed the ability of Black families and Latino families to accumulate assets and accumulate wealth and pass assets and wealth down to their children and their grandchildren. And today we see systems of mass incarceration and other systems I'm going to mention quickly in a minute that are evidence of ongoing institutional racism. And so when I'm talking about systemic racism, I'm not just talking about what we might see as the white supremacist groups like the Klan. Of course, there were just recently some terrible mass shootings in the past few days, and they seem to have been motivated by white supremacist groups. And of course, that's terrible and that's dangerous, and that's not actually the main problem of racism in the United States. The main problem, I would assert, is institutionalized racism, so which functions whether or not people are consciously racist. And so some of the outcomes include a wealth gap in the United States, a racial wealth gap. And if you look at the median, you can see here that there's average and median comparison of wealth by race among white and black households. The median is a little more evocative for me. So the average is, adding everybody up and dividing by the number of people, and you get an average. But the median means that there's an equal number of households above that line and an equal number below. So 50% above, 50% below. And so you can see the white family is represented by the dark blue, and the median wealth of a household for whites in the United States is $134,000. So that means 50% of the white population is above that and 50% below. And for black households, it's $11,000. So that's, over 10 times greater for white households. So that means 50% of black households have less than $11,000 of wealth. And that means, you add up your assets, subtract your debts, and that's your wealth, okay? 50% of blacks would be above that 11,000, but 50% are below it. So that's pretty shocking. And I think that's a result of this long-term legacy and ongoing reality of racism, of institutional racism. This is another chart, and I think it's probably difficult to see, but it shows that the baseline, the black line, actually represents whites. So if we say, that whites have a certain likelihood of a bad outcome in health or education or criminal justice or economics, what's the comparison with people of color, African Americans in this case, and that's the red line. And so anywhere from 2 to 7 times more likely to have a bad outcome in these systems. And so thinking again at the systemic level, institutional level, doesn't really require people in those systems to be consciously racist, but I would say that these outcomes are a result of ongoing institutional racism. So, for me, learning about this over the past several years about racism has been very challenging and very difficult. It's been a huge stretch for me. I've got a complex family history myself. My immediate family comes from West Virginia, coal mining family. My grandfathers were coal miners, great-grandfathers, coal miners, farmers, basically poor whites in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia and Kentucky, going back several generations. But I also have a great-grandfather who was in the Klan in West Virginia. And if you go back far enough to South Carolina in the mid-1800s, I have slave-owning ancestors as well. So my family history is complex. It's disturbing in some ways. But one antidote, for white people and white groups to start talking about how do we approach this topic of racism is that we can adopt a radical or progressive white identity. So we can, look at our ethnic background and the history of how our families have been assimilated into white culture, what that has meant for our privilege, but also some of our suffering. So we have multiple identities, and we can make a commitment to work for justice and for equality, and we can make a commitment to this ongoing process of learning and growth and development. So circling back to this idea of collaborative culture, and how do we connect it to what we're doing in the intentional communities movement. And this is something that based on an article by Tema Okun called White Supremacy Culture. And I just read this in the past year, and it was really kind of shocking for me to think about my current community and how much, and we're trying to create an eco-village, and we have a sense of ourselves as, we're very progressive and we're cutting edge and we're doing all this stuff around sustainability. And we've been talking about racism and addressing it, and we're still a mostly white group, but in some ways we are pretty cutting edge. And at the same time, I think we have a tendency to reproduce the dominant organizational culture in the United States, which is white culture. I would also call it patriarchal culture. So maybe this is a little too simple of a chart. I think we could call this patriarchal white culture in the United States. And so on the one side, you see the values and the orientation there. of statistics and rules and being linear in thinking and focusing on technology, and dichotomous thinking is either or, focusing on professionals and individualism and efficiency and hierarchy. And that's part of white culture in the United States. And that, if we in our intentional communities or co-housing communities, if we're reproducing that culture unconsciously, it's probably not very welcoming to people of color to join our group, to join our community, and to work with us. But a lot of us are at least claiming that we want to create cooperative culture or relational culture. So we want to be more relationship oriented. We want to be more in touch with our emotions, our creativity. We want to have both and thinking instead of either or thinking. We want to develop leadership in a different way and focus on community and accountability and empowerment and equity. And I think those are very important goals. And I think if we're committed to those goals, we are committed to challenging the dominant white patriarchal culture in the United States. And I don't think that a lot of communities are conscious about this challenge. And it is a great challenge. It's a big challenge. Part of the challenge is we've all been traumatized by racism. And of course, people of color more than white people, but white people too. It's a traumatic system. We have generational trauma that's passed down. And it's really important, I think, to make a commitment to social and personal healing and take care of ourselves as we're doing this kind of work. And also try to identify strategies where we can address racism in a healthy way and productively in our groups. I think this is my last slide, but just to say a word about resilience, which one understanding of resilience is a system or an individual or a group can maintain its health and its ability to flourish and even its core identity, even when there's a lot of change and there's a lot of challenges and stresses. So resilience is the ability to navigate change and stress and still stay healthy and still be who we are. And so the list on the text part of the slide are some things that work for me to maintain resilience, and that includes healthy connections to nature and friends, both in community and out of community. It's helpful to have both for me. Mentors, spiritual practices, this ongoing conscious commitment to growth and learning as part of my community journey, recognizing that community is this opportunity for growth and change. And it's also an opportunity for us to make a positive contribution to the world. And I believe the world is in deep need, as we are as individuals and groups, of making change and making positive change and addressing some of these challenges. The image is from a stream in the mountains of North Carolina that I visited a few years ago. And actually, I was on my way back from the 2017 National Cohousing Conference in Nashville, and I stopped and did a little camping in the mountains, and so it's a photograph from the North Carolina mountains. But I love this image, and I think it's a nice metaphor for resilience because there's a lot of change happening, right? The water is constantly flowing through there, but there's a lot of beauty there too. And there's some stability, and I'm sure, over decades or hundreds or thousands of years, that stream has changed dramatically, and so we probably wouldn't recognize it. And so, but in the short term, it maintains a certain identity and health and well-being, and that leads to a really beautiful vision, a beautiful place to visit. And so that's my hope for us as communitarians and also as individuals, that we can maintain our resilience, but also engage with these challenges around conflict, but also addressing racism. And we can frame our approach to community more and more as a challenge of personal growth and also as cultural change and social transformation. Well, thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
I have a question, Joe. So how, in a community that is all white and is not looking at any issues of race, and I do have a background in doing some diversity work and facilitation in a school, which I no longer do. I'm retired. But do you have suggestions about how one might begin to introduce that topic into a co-housing group?
Yeah, I do, and I think a couple of ideas. One is I would say try to start building relationships with other people who are interested in the topic, and so you build kind of a core group that's well educated, and so that's a good place to begin. It's really important to have some foundation in the history and the current reality of what's going on. And then expect resistance. Mostly white groups are going to resist the conversation, and there are patterns. You can read about this. There are patterns of how white people resist the conversation, or we try to avoid the conversation at all costs, right? So expect that, and don't get too discouraged by it. There will be resistance. There will be confusion. There will be pain. There will be trauma resurfacing for people, and they may not be equipped to deal with that. So it has helped me to frame the conversation in the way that I've been describing. This is a journey of healing and learning and understanding. We're not trying to shame anybody or blame anybody or attack anybody. We're trying to do better as communitarians who are interested in sustainability and justice. How can we do better together, and let's talk about some questions. Why is our group so white? How did that happen? I think it has something to do with the history of racism and wealth distribution in the United States, probably. So let's talk about that. And that's a good starting point for the conversation. But sometimes groups get stuck in the diversity vortex and I shouldn't call it a vortex because it's a very important conversation, and there are many different dimensions of diversity that need to be addressed. But oftentimes when communities are talking about diversity, they might actually be talking about race and racism, and they're not doing it directly. And so what I encourage groups to do is just come out and say it. I am talking about race and racism. I believe racism exists, and this is an important conversation for white people to have.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And there's a connection to the earlier part of the presentation about conflict, of having agreements, tools, practices in place, having a culture of care in place already is going to help a lot when you get to the racism conversation. So, having just ongoing skill development and our capacity to have compassion for one another and listen to one another and care for one another, we need to practice that when the stakes are low. So when the stakes are higher, we have some capacity and some tools that we can use to address those high stakes conversations. And if you don't have questions, I'm also interested in hearing what are people's strategies for resilience? How do you feel about this? This paradigm of community is about growth and learning and change. Does that make sense to you, or does it not make sense to you?
Joe, hi, my name is Diane, and I just joined, so please forgive me if I missed the first few minutes. I am especially interested in trying to glean whatever I can learn from the co-housing community to apply it to a larger 55 plus community that I live in. So I'm listening for those kinds of things, and I think many of the tools and the challenges are the same. Mm-hmm. But the sheer size of our community and shallow depth, I should say, of the relationships mm-hmm. here seem to be special challenges. I don't want to divert from the co-housing model if that's the focus, but I just wanted to share with you what I'm listening for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I hope that a lot of what I'm saying is applicable across intentional communities, and also any collaborative groups, and a lot of nonprofit groups that are trying to be more collaborative and less hierarchical. This applies to them as well. I hope they're trying to create a culture, a group culture of cooperation and care and concern for justice, and and I think those are really important missions. And so, yeah, we do find those missions in other organizations, not just intentional communities and not just co-housing communities. So hopefully this is applicable. But what you were saying about the relationships, maybe you have a concern that some of the relationships are shallow, and that is a challenge, and that that's a legitimate concern as we start trying to address conflict. Just like I also use the metaphor for community as like a marriage, right, or an intimate relationship. You're getting to know people, you're getting closer to them, you're sharing resources. Your well-being is tied more closely to them than in conventional neighborhoods, than in conventional organizations. And I think that's what inspires a lot of us to get involved in communities. We want that, but it's also scary, and we may not be prepared for it. We don't necessarily know what we're getting ourselves into. That was my experience. And we don't recognize that we don't have the skills, and it takes a while to develop, relationships. And some of that development is going to be challenging and even painful. But I like to talk about a healthy stretch. Can we stretch in ways that are healthy and keep stretching without, tearing our muscles, right? We don't want to hurt ourselves, and we don't want to damage our relationships. But it is important to nurture those bonds and those relationships and strengthen them as an ongoing practice and commitment in cooperative groups, whether they're intentional communities or nonprofit groups. Those it's important to attend to that, and I see a lot of groups not attending to that enough because of the pressures of we have a business meeting, we have limited time, we've got to talk about the budget, we've got to talk about there's mold in the common house, and we've got to figure that out, and we don't have time to hear about your feelings and strengthen our relationships. But that's actually really essential that we make time to do that. Because we're not going to be able to withstand some of the challenges that are definitely coming towards us if we don't have strong relationships and strong bonds with one another.
I agree completely. And one of the things that I'm noticing, I have to put this gently, I'm seeing a lot of dementia. And so we have a board of directors, for example, who exhibits a fair amount of memory issues and can't remember things that were agreed to in previous meetings, and thank goodness they were documented. But so it creates a special challenge, because it's hard to get people to step into leadership roles to begin with. Mm-hmm. And when the people who are willing to step into them have active cognitive issues, what they end up doing is basically abdicating any due diligence or research to a paid administrator. And so it really creates a very passive environment, which I think is harder to allow to happen in a smaller co-housing community. Mm-hmm. But those are some of the challenges that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of co-housing communities have challenges of keeping people engaged in governance. Typically after a few years, and maybe there's cycles, the different rhythms in this, but you may have maybe a third of the community who's still coming to business meetings or consensus governance meetings or sociocracy meetings. And so you find there's people have a lot of pressures in their lives, and we exist in this larger culture that is putting a lot of pressure on us. It's not easy to make a living out here and take care of our needs. And it's hard, to commit the time to really learning how to cooperate and govern together and make decisions together and build these relationships on a different type of foundation. So I think people are under a lot of pressure and stress. I see this in the nonprofit world as well. And it's dangerous because, we burn out our leaders. We I didn't really talk about this too much, but I mentioned, we need an alternative approach to leadership and how we care for our leaders, because the mainstream culture, we have a very hierarchical system with a few leaders, and then the rest of us, what are we? We're consumers or critics or whatever we are, complainers. So we want the leaders to go get things done, and then we also want to complain about it. And then we bring that attitude into our communities, and it's really hard on our leadership. It's very difficult because we expect so much of them, and then we're very quick to criticize them. So, can we take, all of us take more responsibility for creating the type of group or community that we want to create, and realize that that's shared leadership, and we have to cultivate that together with the demands of raising our family and making a living and paying the bills and moving cross country. I just looked at your photo, Karen. There's so many demands on us in this modern society. It's really hard. And so I think that puts pressure on groups, even the best intentioned groups who are using a sociocracy or consensus, and we're gathering together and we're trying to decide collaboratively, but we bring this pressure of, we've only got 2 hours and we've got to be efficient and we've got to get to the agenda and it's packed, and we don't have time to slow down and get to know one another, and we don't have time to practice our conflict tools. Let's wait until there's a volcanic eruption and then we'll try to use our conflict tools, but then it's kind of too late. We're not going to do a good job. So it's really hard. It's really challenging. And I think there's pressure, for some of us in the communities movement and in co-housing, tends to be more middle class and upper class people because of affordability issues. And so we're kind of used to hiring out. If we can't do something, we might have the resources to hire out. And I think that's connected to what you were saying, Diane, about, I don't have time to do this myself, but I do have a little extra money, so I'm going to hire somebody to do it. But, we're going to hire somebody to do it. But then that's in tension with our goal of, we're trying to be more sustainable and a little more self-sufficient, and we're trying to build relationships and collaborate, within our group and take care of our own needs as much as we can.
Joe, I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but Anne had a question, just commenting that there's a lot of information, and was wondering if you have a bibliography to share or to start with, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a documentary series. One of my slides was from that series. It's called "Race: The Power of an Illusion," and sometimes you can find it on the interweb on YouTube, but you might find it in a library. It's called "Race: The Power of an Illusion." It's a 3-part series. It's very powerful and helpful. There's a book called "Witnessing Whiteness" that I found incredibly helpful and important. And that's the idea about radical white identity came from that book. And that book itself is a distillation of a lot of sources and a lot of research over the past 20 years. So it's a really valuable resource. And the author, she tells a lot of personal stories. So it's not written like an academic book, but it's using a lot of the best cutting edge research around race and racism in the past few decades. So it's called "Witnessing Whiteness." There's another book called, and I guess I can type that in too. So "Witnessing Whiteness," "White Fragility," "Tears We Cannot Stop." Michael Eric Dyson, African American author, very powerful book, and it just came out in the past few years. So those are good places to start. There's some other stuff that I think is more academic research based that doesn't speak to me as much, but is very important. So there's a huge amount of research that's been done, and some of those slides is a distillation of that research, but it's important stuff. So one of the references I made too in the slideshow is my grandmother's hands. That should be hands, not hand. Sorry. And that's written by an African-American therapist who works with trauma. And he has a really embodied approach, and his view is that all of us have trauma from racism in our bodies, and he has different sections on African Americans, white people, and the police. And he talks about how we have all been traumatized because of our relation and our experiences to racism in this country. And he talks about strategies for trying to heal and address that. So that's also really, for me, a really important book. So hopefully those are some good places to start.
I have an observation, and that is that it'd be real interesting to see this conflict item elaborated on from the viewpoint of the patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that a lot of co-housing projects, because of the financial cost of entry, are mostly white and certainly majority female, I suspect. And I think the male-female dichotomy is probably a bigger source of conflict than race in many co-housing projects.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's really important, and I think you're right. It's not, even though communities may have majority women, doesn't mean that they're matriarchal or they're egalitarian. They're functioning in an egalitarian way. It's that a lot of the patriarchal culture is unconscious, and we've all been trained in it. And especially for us men, it comes out of us, and it comes out of me in ways that I don't notice, until I've done some damage. And so it's a very difficult and delicate conversation, because oftentimes, in my experience in intentional communities, there's a lot of idealism, and and to speak for myself, I want to believe I'm a progressive person. I'm not just a reduction to my demographics as a white male or an older white male, but yet I was raised in this culture, and I have racism in me, and I have sexism in me, and it affects my behavior. And it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to address. It's a difficult thing for people to raise. And oftentimes, especially we as white men, we don't see it, and we get really defensive when someone tries to address it with us. So that's a really important point about the importance of addressing ongoing sexism and patriarchal dynamics in our culture and in our groups. And it's a really important topic. And I see a lot of women in leadership positions in the intentional communities movement, and that's good. And I think they tend to they get more pressure, they do more work, they get less appreciation, they get more criticism. So it's really difficult. So I try to give a lot of appreciation and gratitude to the women leaders in this movement, because they're really crucial, and they're working hard, and they're not getting a whole lot of appreciation and support. So thanks, Karen and Karen.
So we have just a couple more minutes. If anybody has any final questions or comments, I did want to acknowledge, Dean, I saw your prompt earlier asking everyone, how have you dealt with racism in your co-housing community? And so if anybody wants to take a little bit of the last couple of minutes to respond to that, that'd be great.
And I'll say too, I'll just make a plug for an article that I wrote for Communities Magazine back in 2018. It's called "I'm Not a Racist, but Racism is in Me and in My Community," and it talks a little bit about my journey with this. So some of the same themes, I've mentioned tonight, but it mentions some specific things that my current community we've done to try to address racism, including adopting a principle around racism that acknowledges we have been affected by racism, we have racism in us, and we're committed to working for racial equity. And then also trying to build relationships with organizations led by people of color, organizations that are working for racial justice. We're encouraging, we haven't started requiring it yet, but we're talking about requiring that all of our members take a racial equity training, like a weekend training. So we're getting close to requiring that in our membership. Several of us have done that. So those are some of the steps that we have pursued.
And that article was republished on our blog, so you can also find it on cohousing.org/blog.
Thank you.
All righty, well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We all have homework now. And so thank you, Joe. I appreciate your time and I appreciate the work that you're doing. And thank you all for being here tonight. Putting on these web chats does take some staff time. So if you or someone you know might be interested in sponsoring a web chat, contact us, either Karen or myself, if you want to show your support monetarily to the association. You can do that. Being an evergreen member, that's our new fancy thing that we're working on. Any of those things can be found through cohousing.org. The next web chat is next Wednesday, August 14th. Same time, same place, and it's Laura Fitch speaking about design programming. She says, making decisions about architectural design is complicated and potentially stressful. Upfront programming is critical. She'll discuss ideas for successful design decision making. So the web chat schedule, as well as links to past web chats, the recordings, can be found on cohousing.org. And you can just search web chats and it'll pop right up.
Thank you very much for hosting, and thanks everybody for joining in.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.